The request came through carefully coded diplomatic channels in May 2025, marked with classification indicators suggesting sensitivity beyond routine bilateral communication. The Biden administration, watching Burkina Faso's continued embrace of Russian military advisors and increasingly vocal criticism of Western frameworks, wanted a confidential dialogue away from public scrutiny and media attention. The specific proposal was for a private session during the upcoming UN General Assembly. No formal agenda, no official record, no press involvement. Just senior American officials and Traoré in a secure diplomatic facility discussing what the message carefully termed, creative approaches to mutual challenges that might not be feasible through conventional diplomatic channels. The language was deliberately vague, but the implication was clear. Washington wanted to explore whether deals were possible in private that couldn't be discussed publicly. Perhaps financial incentives for policy shifts. Perhaps security guarantees in exchange for distancing from Russia. Perhaps development packages conditional on governance changes. The kind of arrangements that require discretion because public knowledge would create political complications for both sides. The American calculation was straightforward. Traoré's public rhetoric was uncompromising, but perhaps in private without the need to maintain that public stance, pragmatic arrangements were possible. Many African leaders maintained tough public positions while being more flexible privately when benefits were substantial enough. The request assumed Traoré operated similarly, that his public sovereignty rhetoric was primarily for domestic consumption and regional positioning, while actual policy could be negotiated confidentially. That assumption would prove catastrophically wrong. Traoré received the classified request on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, his response was delivered, not through encrypted diplomatic channels back to Washington, but through a public press conference in Ouagadougou carried live on Burkinabe national television and streamed internationally. Standing at a podium with Burkina Faso's flag behind him, Traoré held up a printed copy of the American diplomatic request with sensitive portions redacted but the core proposal clearly visible. This morning, the United States government sent a classified diplomatic request to my office. The request proposes a private meeting during the upcoming UN General Assembly, no formal agenda, no official record, no press involvement. To discuss what they call creative approaches to mutual challenges that might not be feasible through conventional diplomatic channels. I want to address this request publicly because the request itself reveals important assumptions about how the United States believes international relations should function, and those assumptions need to be challenged openly rather than accepted privately. He paused, then continued with characteristic directness. The United States is proposing a secret meeting to discuss arrangements that cannot be discussed publicly. Why would arrangements need to be secret? Because they involve Burkina Faso making policy concessions that would be politically difficult to justify publicly in exchange for American benefits that would be politically difficult for the United States to provide publicly. In other words, a private deal where both sides get what they want without having to explain to their respective populations why the deal serves their interests. This is exactly the kind of diplomacy that has kept Africa subordinate to external powers for decades. Secret deals negotiated between African leaders and Western officials where African leaders receive personal benefits or regime support in exchange for policies that serve Western interests rather than African populations. The press conference room was completely silent. International media correspondents were frantically sending alerts. This was unprecedented. A head of state was publicly revealing and rejecting a classified diplomatic approach in real time. Traoré wasn't done. My response to the United States is simple and public: no. Burkina Faso does not conduct secret diplomacy about fundamental policy questions. If the United States has proposals for cooperation, make them publicly through normal diplomatic channels where they can be evaluated openly and debated transparently. If proposals cannot be made publicly because they would be politically controversial, that suggests the proposals involve arrangements one or both sides would be uncomfortable defending to their populations. And if we'd be uncomfortable defending arrangements to our people, we shouldn't be making those arrangements regardless of what private benefits are offered. The era of African leaders making secret deals with Western powers that serve external interests while providing personal benefits to leaders is over, at least for Burkina Faso. We make policy decisions based on Burkinabe interests, evaluated through transparent processes, and defended publicly. We don't make secret deals in exchange for private benefits. The United States should not expect private flexibility that contradicts public positions. Our public positions reflect our actual positions. They're not negotiating tactics or domestic political theater. When we say Burkina Faso's policies are not for sale, we mean it, whether the offers come publicly or privately, whether they're presented as development assistance or creative approaches to mutual challenges. The press conference generated immediate international reaction. American officials were furious, not just about the rejection, but about the public disclosure of a classified diplomatic approach and the characterization of U.S. intentions. Within hours, the State Department issued a terse statement: the United States engages in confidential diplomatic communications with nations around the world as standard practice. Characterizing routine diplomatic outreach as inappropriate secret dealing misrepresents both the substance and intent of normal bilateral engagement. We're disappointed that Burkina Faso chose to publicly disclose and mischaracterize a private diplomatic communication rather than engaging constructively through appropriate channels. But the statement rang hollow. Traoré hadn't mischaracterized anything. He'd quoted the actual language about creative approaches that might not be feasible through conventional channels, and accurately interpreted that as proposals for arrangements requiring discretion. The American frustration wasn't about mischaracterization. It was about Traoré refusing to play the game of maintaining public positions while being privately flexible. African media coverage was extensive and largely sympathetic to Traoré's stance. Multiple commentators noted that his approach, insisting on public transparency rather than private deal-making, represented a significant departure from how many African leaders engaged with Western powers. One Kenyan political analyst wrote, "For decades, African leaders have maintained one set of positions publicly while being more accommodating privately when Western powers offered the right inducements. This allowed Western powers to maintain influence while allowing African leaders to maintain public rhetoric about sovereignty and independence." Traoré is breaking that model by insisting his public and private positions are identical and that any proposals must be evaluated transparently rather than through confidential negotiations. This approach only works if the leader genuinely values transparent policy-making over the personal benefits that often accompany private deals. Traoré has demonstrated he does. 2 days after the press conference, senior U.S. officials held background briefing with select journalists attempting damage control. The talking points emphasized that confidential diplomacy was normal practice, that many sensitive negotiations required discretion, and that Traoré's public disclosure of a private diplomatic approach violated diplomatic norms. But the officials couldn't explain why the U.S. had specifically requested a meeting with no official record to discuss approaches not feasible through conventional channels, if the intent was merely routine diplomatic engagement. The attempted spin reinforced rather than contradicted Traoré's characterization. 1 week after Traoré's press conference, at a closed-door NSC meeting, officials debated how to respond. The CIA director noted dryly, "We've now confirmed that Traoré can't be approached privately with proposals we wouldn't make publicly. That eliminates most of our traditional leverage tools, the kinds of inducements or pressure that work when leaders will take private deals they can't defend publicly. If he's genuinely unwilling to be privately flexible regardless of what we offer, and if he'll publicly expose any attempts to privately negotiate arrangements he considers inappropriate, then we have very limited options for influencing Burkina Faso's policies." The NSC Africa director added, "The bigger problem is the precedent. Other African leaders are watching. If Traoré's approach, rejecting private deal-making, insisting on public transparency, exposing confidential diplomatic approaches he considers inappropriate, becomes a model that other leaders adopt, it fundamentally changes how we engage across Africa. Right now, we can have one set of public discussions while privately negotiating actual arrangements. If more African leaders start insisting that private and public positions must align and that policy discussions must be transparent, we lose the ability to quietly secure outcomes we need without public debate about whether they serve African or American interests. 3 weeks after the rejected private session request, Traoré gave an interview to France 24 where he was asked whether he was concerned about damaging relations with the United States by publicly rejecting and disclosing their confidential diplomatic approach. His response was characteristically direct: "I'm not concerned about damaging relations that were based on the assumption that I would be privately flexible in ways I'm not publicly. If U.S. Burkina Faso relations require me making secret deals that I couldn't defend to Burkinabe people transparently, then those relations should be damaged because they're based on false premises." The United States assumed that, like many African leaders, I maintain tough public rhetoric while being more accommodating privately when offered sufficient inducements. That assumption is wrong. My public positions are my actual positions. I don't say one thing publicly and negotiate differently privately. If that makes me a difficult partner for countries accustomed to African leaders who operate that way, so be it. I'd rather have honest adversarial relationship based on genuine disagreement than fake partnership based on private deals that contradict public commitments. The interview response crystallized what had become clear to American officials: Traoré wasn't playing the traditional game of African diplomacy where public rhetoric and private flexibility existed in separate spheres. His insistence on aligning public and private positions eliminated the traditional tools Western powers had used to influence African policy through confidential inducements and pressure. 1 month after the public rejection, at an African Union summit, several African leaders approached Traoré privately to discuss his handling of the U.S. private session request. A Central African president was frank: "What you did," publicly disclosing the American request for confidential meeting and rejecting it in a press conference, that took serious courage. But it also burned a bridge. The Americans will never trust you with sensitive communications again. Doesn't that limit your ability to engage diplomatically? Traoré's response was thoughtful: "It limits my ability to engage in the kind of diplomacy where we say one thing publicly and negotiate different arrangements privately. That's intentional. I don't want that kind of diplomatic engagement because it produces arrangements that leaders can't defend transparently to their populations. If I can't explain a policy decision openly and defend it based on how it serves Burkinabe interests, I shouldn't be making that decision, regardless of what private benefits are offered. Yes, the Americans won't trust me with sensitive communications anymore. But those sensitive communications were attempts to negotiate arrangements requiring discretion because they'd be controversial if public. I don't want to make those arrangements. So losing access to those conversations isn't a cost. It's eliminating a temptation." Another African leader asked the practical question: "But don't you sometimes need flexibility to make deals that serve your interests even if they're politically complicated to defend? Isn't some discretion necessary in diplomacy?" There's a difference between tactical discretion about negotiating positions and structural secrecy about fundamental arrangements. If I'm negotiating the specific terms of a mining contract, I don't announce my bottom line publicly before negotiations. That's tactical discretion. But the fundamental decision about whether to allow foreign mining, under what general framework, and serving what national interests, that should be transparent and publicly defensible. What the United States was proposing wasn't tactical discretion. It was secret negotiations about fundamental policy arrangements that couldn't be publicly discussed. That's the kind of diplomacy that has kept Africa subordinate. And I refuse to participate in it regardless of short-term costs. The conversation revealed a fundamental divide among African leaders. Some believed that effective governance required ability to make pragmatic arrangements privately that would be politically difficult to defend publicly. Others, influenced by Traoré's example, were beginning to question whether private flexibility that contradicted public commitments was pragmatism or subordination. 2 months after the incident, a senior European diplomat requested an off-the-record conversation with Traoré during a development conference in Dakar. The Europeans' purpose was different from the American approach: not to make proposals, but to understand Traoré's thinking. Captain Traoré, I want to understand your position on confidential diplomacy because it has implications beyond US-Burkina Faso relations. You've stated that you won't make private deals that contradict public positions, and that any policy proposals must be evaluated transparently. But doesn't some level of confidential negotiation facilitate arrangements that serve mutual interests but would be politically difficult for both sides if discussed publicly during negotiation? Aren't you eliminating options that could genuinely benefit Burkina Faso by insisting on complete transparency? Traoré appreciated the thoughtful question. You're right that confidential negotiations can sometimes facilitate mutually beneficial arrangements that would be harder to reach if every negotiating position was public. But there's a critical distinction. Confidential negotiations about how to structure an arrangement both sides have publicly committed to pursuing is different from secret negotiations about whether to make arrangements that can't be publicly defended. The first is reasonable diplomatic practice. The second is how subordination gets institutionalized. When the United States requested private session with no official record to discuss approaches not feasible through conventional channels, they weren't proposing confidential negotiations about implementing publicly agreed cooperation. They were proposing secret discussions about arrangements that couldn't be discussed through normal diplomatic channels because they'd be publicly controversial. That's the kind of diplomacy I reject. The European diplomat pressed further. But practically, doesn't your position mean you can only cooperate with partners on terms you can fully defend publicly? That seems to eliminate a lot of potentially beneficial cooperation that might serve Burkina Faso's interests but would be politically complicated to explain. If I can't defend cooperation publicly by explaining how it serves Burkinabe interests, then either the cooperation doesn't actually serve our interests. In which case I shouldn't pursue it regardless of what private benefits are offered, or it does serve our interests but in ways I'm uncomfortable explaining transparently, in which case I should reconsider whether it actually serves our interests or primarily serves my personal interests or regime stability. The test of whether policy serves national interests rather than elite interests is whether it can be defended transparently to the population. If it can't be, that's usually because it doesn't actually serve broad national interests even if it serves narrow elite interests. So yes, my position means I only cooperate on terms I can defend publicly. I consider that a feature, not a limitation. 3 months after the rejected private session, the incident had become a case study in diplomatic training programs and international relations courses. One Harvard Kennedy School professor included it in a seminar on African agency in international relations. Captain Traoré's public rejection of the U.S. request for confidential meeting represents a significant challenge to how Western powers traditionally engage African leaders. The model has been that African leaders maintain sovereignty rhetoric publicly while being privately flexible when offered sufficient inducements. This allows Western powers to secure preferred outcomes while allowing African leaders to maintain domestic political legitimacy. Traoré is rejecting that model by insisting his private and public positions align and by publicly exposing attempts to negotiate secret arrangements. This approach only works if the leader genuinely prioritizes transparent governance over the personal benefits that typically accompany private deal-making. The fact that Traoré has consistently demonstrated that prioritization makes him unusually difficult for Western powers to influence through traditional diplomatic tools. 6 months after the incident, Traoré gave a major address at a Pan-African governance conference where he articulated his philosophy about transparency and private diplomacy more systematically. For decades, African governance has operated on a double track. Public rhetoric about sovereignty, independence, and African interests combined with private arrangements with external powers that often contradicted that public rhetoric. African leaders would publicly criticize Western interference while privately accepting Western inducements for policies that served Western interests. This double track served everyone except African populations. External powers got the policies they wanted. African leaders got the resources and support they needed to maintain power. And African populations got rhetoric about sovereignty while experiencing policies that actually served external interests. Breaking this pattern requires refusing to participate in the double track. When Western powers approach with proposals for private arrangements that can't be discussed publicly, the response must be public rejection and public disclosure. Not because confidential diplomacy is inherently problematic, but because proposals requiring secrecy usually involve arrangements that serve external interests and elite interests rather than broad national interests. If a proposal genuinely serves national interests, it can be defended publicly. If it can't be defended publicly, that's usually because it doesn't serve national interests regardless of what private benefits it offers to leaders. The address was widely covered and generated significant discussion among African civil society organizations and opposition movements. Multiple groups began demanding that their governments adopt similar transparency standards, arguing that if Burkina Faso could insist on aligning public and private positions, other African nations should as well. 8 months after the incident, the Trump administration returned to power in the United States. The new administration's approach to Africa was even more transactional than Biden's had been, but also more openly so. When Trump officials approached African leaders, they were explicit about what the U.S. wanted and what America would provide in exchange. There was less pretense about shared values or partnership and more direct discussion about interests and trade-offs. Ironically, Traoré found Trump's directness preferable to Biden's values framing even though he rejected both approaches. Trump administration is at least honest that they want specific policy outcomes from African nations and are willing to provide benefits in exchange. Biden administration dressed up the same transactional approach in language about partnership and shared values. I reject both. Burkina Faso's policies aren't for sale whether the offers are framed as transactional exchanges or partnership opportunities. But Trump's honesty about it is preferable to pretending transactions are principles. 1 year after the rejected private session request, when asked whether he regretted the public disclosure and whether it had harmed Burkina Faso's diplomatic relationships, Traoré's assessment was characteristically direct. The United States requested private meeting with no official record to discuss creative approaches to mutual challenges not feasible through conventional diplomatic channels. That language clearly indicated they wanted to explore secret arrangements that couldn't be discussed publicly. I rejected the request publicly and disclosed it because the request itself represented exactly the kind of diplomacy that keeps Africa subordinate, secret deals between African leaders and Western officials where leaders receive private benefits in exchange for policies serving external interests. Do I regret the disclosure? No. It established clearly that Burkina Faso doesn't participate in that kind of diplomacy. Did it harm our diplomatic relationships? It harmed relationships based on the assumption that I would be privately flexible in ways I'm not publicly. Those relationships should be harmed because they were based on false premises. Countries that want to engage Burkina Faso now understand they must do so transparently, that proposals must be publicly defensible, and that private inducements won't produce policies that contradict public commitments. That's not diplomatic isolation, that's diplomatic clarity. He continued. Some argue that my approach eliminates beneficial cooperation that requires discretion to negotiate. But I distinguish between tactical confidentiality during negotiations and structural secrecy about fundamental arrangements. Confidential talks about how to implement cooperation both sides have publicly committed to, that's reasonable. Secret negotiations about whether to make arrangements that can't be publicly discussed, that's how subordination gets institutionalized. The United States wasn't proposing the former. They were proposing the latter. And I reject it regardless of what benefits are offered privately, regardless of what consequences are threatened publicly, and regardless of how many other African leaders accept similar arrangements. Burkina Faso's governance will be transparent and publicly defensible, or it won't happen. That's not negotiable. Not publicly. And not privately. 2 years after the incident, multiple African nations had adopted variations of Traoré's transparency framework. Not necessarily rejecting all confidential diplomacy, but demanding that fundamental policy arrangements be publicly defensible and refusing to make secret deals that contradicted public commitments. The shift represented a significant change in how some African leaders engaged with external powers, moving from the traditional double-track model toward greater alignment between public rhetoric and private arrangements. Western diplomatic officials adapted by being more careful about what they proposed privately, recognizing that some African leaders would publicly expose proposals they considered inappropriate attempts at secret deal-making.